Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of season 8 of Crypto Sapiens. My name is Rachel, and I'll be your host for today. I'm joined today by Adam Miller from MIDAO and Josh, that lawyer, from Fungibility Group. And today we're going to be talking about a topic that's on a lot of people's minds. So, legal framework for DAOs. This is something really important with the emergence of DAOs to ensure that each DAO is legally compliant from an organizational standpoint. And I can also speak a bit to the individual incorporation and legal factors as well. So I'm joined today, Adam Miller's from MIDAO. So he's been dealing with the incorporation of DAOs as a whole, and Josh has been dealing with different legal concepts in the Web3 space. So without further ado, I'll pass the mic over to Adam to give his introduction, and we'll head over to Josh.
Yeah, hey everyone. Great to be here. Thank you, Rachel. It's really exciting to be on Crypto Sapiens. Longtime listener, by the way. I got into Web3, a long time ago, 2012, when Bitcoin came, not when Bitcoin came out, when I read about the Silk Road. And I was like, wait, there's a dark web? There's like this secret online marketplace that like I've never heard of? I had to see it. And so I discovered Bitcoin, but it wasn't until around 2020 with all the excitement on Ethereum that I really got into crypto, saw the light. And after doing a bunch of research, I decided, one, I needed to leave my corporate America job and go full-time into crypto. And two, that it had to be related to DAOs. So I ended up starting this company, MIDAO, MIDAO, which provides legal and regulatory frameworks for DAOs. And in particular, our first product is a partnership with the government of the Marshall Islands, which is a sovereign nation in the South Pacific, through which we've passed legislation and created a DAO LLC, which is a legal entity made just for DAOs. So excited to talk with you more about it.
Awesome. Yeah. And Adam, you keep busy, man. I see you at all these conferences with your dog on your lap, like just busy, going out there, making connections IRL. And this is something I've talked about on the last episode too, on AI and Web3. We were talking about the importance of showing up and continuing to build community in person. So you are a huge proponent of that, showing up and helping to build community at these events.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of, the idea of presence. In fact, I talk to my daughter about that all the time. A lot of relationships are built on just being there.
Absolutely. And Josh, I saw on LinkedIn not too long ago, like your picture in Times Square at NFT NYC. Like that's huge, man. Like
that's pretty cool. I have to admit, I've done pretty neat things in my career, but when they told me that they were going to be putting all of us on Times Square, I went and, took my camera out and, waited 15 minutes until my face popped up. I don't know if I showed up more than once or not, but it was pretty neat to be there. With all the other neat things I've done in my career, being on Times Square is like, I've never been on Times Square.
I'm going to share my screen for those watching. This is just a little preview here on Josh's LinkedIn. So what a cool accomplishment to have our Web3 community showcased in Times Square. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was pretty neat. And, interestingly enough, because they had so many speakers there, the photos were, kind of small, and that's no denigration on NFT New York or anything, but they were kind of small. And ultimately, the way people were able to find me in that picture is because I've always got not too far from me a pair of green glasses.
Oh, yeah. Wow. So, I think this is one of the first times I've ever spoken to you without your green glasses on.
Wow. I don't wear them at home. I don't wear glasses at all at home. It's a secret.
So Josh has green glasses and I have a multi-poo. And so you should be able to find either of us very easily at any crypto conference.
I always have the green glasses on. It's even our logo.
So Josh, I'd love to hear about how you got started in Web3, what you're working on now with Fungibility Group, and what gets you out of bed every morning, man.
Well, I'm a single dad, so I have no choice but to wake up. But with Web3, I'd done work in startups for the better part of 20 years, and I did other law as well, like personal injury and criminal law. Every attorney makes the joke, why do attorneys do criminal law is because it pays. And ultimately about 5 years ago when CryptoKitties was coming out, I had a client that had a comic book company, and they said, "Hey, Josh, we want to do something like CryptoKitties. Can we do it?" And that was my answer. I just stared at them. I had no idea. I said, I don't know. And so I basically said, man, I know nothing about crypto. I have no idea where to steer you. And more specifically, like this is not something I've ever thought about, right? Like this is not even something I've, contemplated. So they said, well, we want you to contemplate it because you're cheaper than a real attorney. And I said, thank you guys. That's very appreciated. Somebody really likes you when they say stuff like that to you. So ultimately I went down the rabbit hole. I figured out that it was a lot like a lot of the startup work I'd been doing for 20 years. And I said, yeah, I can do this. I mean, there's nothing that's rocket science that changes from going to regular startup space to crypto space. And the biggest issue is how do we form it in a way that is maybe a little bit safer, in a smart legal way than maybe another way. And so I put it on my LinkedIn and, it was, without being too crass, it was a little bit like where flies like to fly on my profile. And so saying you're a crypto lawyer definitely draws both interest and, interestingly, it draws a lot of people that you may not want to work with. But you get a little bit of both and you see a lot of very cool things. I've seen a lot of projects from ideation all the way to, hey, this is a, $1 billion market cap. And I think it's pretty cool because I wouldn't have ever gotten that chance had I not just been dragged kicking and screaming into crypto.
Wow, that's quite an origin story there, man. But it's definitely something that's necessary. I feel like for someone who has earned full time working on DAOs and earning in crypto, I feel like the tax piece is so complicated since we're in such a new space. So we definitely need all the lawyers like you, Josh, coming in and helping us kind of sift through the unclear regulations and tax laws and everything. But I think, projects like MIDAO, projects like Fungibility Group, and even Opolis a bit too for the individual. I think projects like these coming up is really going to help to legitimize employment in the Web3 space and help people have all of those things they need from a compliance standpoint. So today, I really want to focus on DAOs and just talk about the legal considerations and legal framework for DAOs. So before we get too deep in the weeds there, I just want to ask you both in your own words, can you briefly explain what a DAO is? And I think it's important to come back to this and break it down when talking about DAOs, just to break down the jargon and vernacular and make it be as understandable and digestible as possible. So in your own words, please explain what a DAO is and why it's gained significant attention in the Web3 space.
Love it. Let's do it. I love this question because
go,
everyone
Adam.
still has very different answers. To us at MIDAO, we have a very legal and technical definition of what a DAO is to us. And it is any organization that uses the blockchain for one or more of these three things: membership tracking, usually through tokens; governance, usually through voting on chain or off chain cryptographically; and treasury management, in that you're keeping some or all of your money on chain and controlling it through that governance process as the group of members that's tracked with the tokens. Now, why does this matter? Well, this technological substrate makes it possible to create organizations that are much more decentralized and oftentimes much more democratic than anything we've ever had before, because it reduces the starting cost and scaling cost of running an organization in this structure, right? So we've had organizations that in 1 week go from 0 to 100,000 members and raise $40 million to try to buy the Constitution, for example. And it just literally was not possible with organizations of the past to start an organization that fast, raise money that fast, and hold a vote between 100,000 people as often as you want at almost no cost. And so what people are really excited about with DAOs, and I often have people argue or debate with me, well, just because you do those things on chain, what if you have a CEO? What if you have a board? What if you have a hierarchy? I actually think you can still be a DAO and have those things if you want to. But the point is that you don't have to anymore, because we've developed the substrate that allows you to have organizations that are much more democratic than anything we've ever had before. And I think that's what most people in Web3 are excited about, even though I think in the long run, probably the most impact will come from DAOs that blend the old model with the new model and are more democratic, but don't necessarily vote on every single decision and every single time you want to spend money.
Wow. Round of applause for that breakdown. I'm still processing and absorbing that. It's kind of like we can leave this open for DAOs to really take the best of both worlds. Like what has worked from the Web 2 space, from traditional organizations, fuse that with, the ethos of Web3 and things we're trying to accomplish here. And, scalability is a factor, inclusion is a factor, kind of removing hierarchy if necessary. But I think, with human nature, that's just going to come about in its own ways. But I think every DAO, it comes in different forms, different sizes, different shapes, and they each have like their own unique purpose or reason for being. So I think they should adjust like how they operate based on that to accomplish their goals.
Yeah,
so I think that's a really awesome synopsis, Adam. Yeah. So Josh, in your own words, what is a DAO in your own words, and why has it grown in such significance in the Web3 space?
So I generally always differ slightly from what Adam says. Most of the time, it's just because I'm being a lawyer. It's just that I see things slightly differently. Like a DAO kind of started as this degen idea of being able to do things without filing anything, right? And while that is never my advice, like people ask me what you should do. I say, well, don't do that, do anything but that. But ultimately, I think there's a movement of people trying to move away from this idea of I have to have a, some sort of corporate formation that a government, approves. So ultimately, it was like the way of like forming and doing things in a very degen way, a la some of the swap services you saw that on initially. And while I think that's super cool, the degen idea, I also don't think it's workable in the long term because people like their houses. I mean, you have a nice fireplace there in the background. I assume you don't want somebody else taking that, right? So that's kind of where companies and lawyers that do incorporation kind of come in is how do we make this degen idea into a more acceptable idea? And you've now seen that happen in Marshall Islands. You've seen it happen in Wyoming. You're seeing some other countries have interest in having some sort of regulation over DAOs. But ultimately, it's becoming more of a CDAO sort of situation, in my opinion, where it's like a centralized, decentralized DAO. And I know saying decentralized DAO is, like calling TCHI is, the same idea. But with that being said, I think it's this, if you just break it down to its base level, it's the idea of having this cooperative community do something. And it mostly tends to be online because we don't need a computer in between us to make a decision if all three of us are going out to eat, where are we going to go out to eat and who's going to pay what. When you have people from very disparate parts of the planet, you need something to, kind of keep track of, well, Johnny said this. No, Johnny did not say that. So I think it's just an idea, a growing idea of how we communicate in person with our friends is what DAOs really kind of grew out of. That doesn't mean it's perfect for business, but it is kind of where it grew from.
Yeah, I just want to add. So I think one of the really interesting things about DAOs is we're working on both evolutionary DAOs and revolutionary DAOs. And evolutionary DAOs, to me, are the ones that want to fit into the existing legal frameworks, right? They're just trying to operate a business or a charity or an association. They want to fit into the law. They're not trying to like subvert or start a revolution against any governments.
Revolution, yeah.
But then you do have the more revolutionary DAOs, which are the ones that are using this technology as a way to have censorship resistance in organizing people and resources. So think about, for example, folks in China or Russia that might want to organize against the government, and America that might want to organize against the government and not be stopped.
I wasn't going to say that out loud.
Yeah. I mean, wherever it is, right? Like, or think about even the Canadian trucker protests from about a year ago, where the government froze the bank accounts of truckers because they were protesting and not doing their job, which is something you'd never expect to happen in Canada. So next time there's a trucker protest, they're going to start a DAO where they can raise money and use that money to support and sustain themselves in a way that the government cannot stop them from organizing and cannot stop them from raising and spending money as a group. And so that type of DAO is also very important. It's just not the type of DAO that MIDAO is working on, and probably not the type that Josh is supporting either, because those are DAOs that are really trying to subvert the law, and DAOs as a technology can be used for that too. Yeah, I won't tell Josh. Anyways, so.
Wow. Well, I love it. I feel like there's a lot of interesting perspectives now that are just on my mind when it comes to the evolutionary versus revolutionary perspective of DAOs. Wow, that's really interesting. I guess at Opolis, we tend to lean more towards like helping the individual to make sure they're hitting all their compliance boxes, which personally for me, that just feels good, to know like, okay, the IRS is not going to come after me. I'm paying my taxes, tax compliant, got my benefits, got my neatly packaged W-2 and pay stubs, and that just feels good for me, but to each their own, right? But going back to the question of what is a DAO, I just want to share something that I wrote. I recently published something with Jairus James. So we wrote a Medium article together called Benefit of the DAO. And I'll just share really quick a couple core components that we wrote, or similar core principles of DAOs. So I think these 4 things are really important with DAOs. And I've gone over this in a previous episode, but I'll just reiterate here. I think voting and governance. So decisions are made somehow autonomously through some sort of voting mechanism and governance, and then use of blockchain technology too. So it's a decentralized autonomous organization. So in some way, blockchain technology is leveraged, typically using smart contracts to perform transactions on chain. And then decentralization. So in theory, like this would eliminate hierarchy and implement peer-to-peer decision-making. And then collective vision. I think this one's really important, that the work is done collectively towards a common goal, with an emphasis on community and collaboration. So those are my 4 similar core principles that I thought of. And I really think, like I mentioned before, each DAO has its own signature reason for being. And I think it's okay that these structural components vary from DAO to DAO based on what their individual goals are. So that being said, we've gone over, in our own words, what a DAO is, and now moving into the legal framework. So both of you work heavily in this realm, helping DAOs incorporate and helping individuals navigate the legal landscape of DAOs. So what are the key components when it comes to incorporating a DAO? And are there any specific challenges or unique aspects that differ from traditional corporate structures? And we can start with Adam.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, it's important to note that I'm not a lawyer and MIDAO is not a law firm, right? We're a company that is creating legal technology and providing legal services, but really we're going to have to turn to Josh for the ultimate kind of comparison of jurisdictions around the world. We're focused right now on the Marshall Islands. So we've helped create one specific kind of legal entity, which is a nonprofit or for-profit DAO LLC that is based off of an LLC, but a little bit different. The reason it's important that it's a little bit different is that DAOs do some things differently from traditional companies. And it goes back again to my definition of a DAO, but what it is traditional companies, usually you have to keep, for example, the names and physical addresses of all your members. You might even, if you're a corporation, have to have stock certificates and signatures from all your members. DAOs do not collect the names and physical addresses of all their members and don't want to print stock certificates. Most traditional corporate forms also have something like managers, directors, boards, which again, most DAOs don't want to have these things. And so you can't use those traditional corporate structures. Same thing goes for record keeping. A lot of corporate structures have record keeping requirements that force you to write things down on paper or by email. For example, when you make a governance decision, you have to record it in minutes or in a document. So all of these things are things that DAOs don't want to do. So we took the LLC statute in the Marshall Islands, which is a sovereign nation, but based its corporate law off of Delaware, which is, one of the most popular places in the world to form a company. And we simply changed the requirements so that you don't have to have managers. You can designate an algorithm if you're using an algorithm on chain as the vote counter, effectively the manager of the organization. You don't have to keep paper records as long as you're keeping records on chain. You don't have to have any managers or officers who take on special liability and special power over the organization. And so by doing that, we've created basically what is an LLC, but is really friendly for DAOs. And I want to add one more thing, which is, like to Josh's earlier point that having a legal entity centralizes you as a DAO. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that whatever government wants to, for a moment, consider you a centralized person, like happened recently in the DAO case, they're going to consider you to be that person, and they're going to sue you, and they're going to potentially find you guilty and come after the individuals in that DAO for the repercussions, like losing your house, for example. By choosing a jurisdiction like the Marshall Islands, you're simply saying, look, if you're going to come after us, then you have to come after us here. And in addition to that the members themselves, unless they've committed a criminal act, will not be held liable for the actions of the organization. Only the organization itself will be held liable. But in your founding documents, in what's usually called an operating agreement for an LLC or a DAO LLC, you can actually enforce decentralization through the way you write those agreements. So again, for example, you can put an algorithm in charge of the organization, and that's the algorithm that's counting the votes. You can make it clear that no person has a fiduciary duty to the organization, that everyone is an equal member, maybe one token, one vote, maybe one member, one vote. So I think one of the interesting things about these legal entities, like what we've done in the Marshall Islands, is we've actually given you a way to enforce decentralization to the extent that you want it, while creating this entity that takes on the liability in a particular jurisdiction.
Wow. So I'd love to hear Josh's thoughts on this.
I'll just agree.
Really? No way.
No.
Impossible.
No.
I feel like it's your job. It's your job.
I wouldn't do that.
He's never just agreed with me. It's impossible.
By the way, I just want to disclaim,
there.
just to disclaim up for this episode, none of this is legal advice. This is strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. We're just here to educate. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah. So on my end, Adam is very focused on a specific task. And my job is not really the focusing of a specific task. It's asking lots of questions, figuring out if a DAO is the right structure, or a DAO LLC in Adam's case, or a co-op in Colorado, or a C Corp or S Corp, or there's other entities internationally. Every country has its own little, quinkly dink, and that's a technical term, on
nuances,
how you form.
Taking notes over here.
I like quinkly dinks better.
Quinkly dinks.
Quinkly dinks. Yeah, but ultimately, while we're specifically talking about DAOs, my job is very rarely to focus on a DAO absent somebody saying, hey, Josh, this is what we are going to do. Help us get through it. Most of the time, my job is more along the lines of, what are you building? Why are you building it? Who are you building it for? Who are your investors? Okay, now that I know all this information, and I can see that your information on your website and your white paper all line up, here are the different ways we can build this thing. And sometimes that might be in the form of a DAO. And sometimes even on the DAO side, a DAO may have control over a particular element of a project where it's not the whole thing, but maybe it's, the equivalent of the DAO being the board, or the DAO having specific actions for, burn rates on a particular project, or whatever the case may be. There's some very specific things that a DAO can do well. And as an attorney, the one thing that Adam has heard me say a million times is there's other things that DAOs do very poorly. So my job is to look at not just DAOs, but look at the overall project and to say, where are you going and how can we get you there? And a DAO may be one of those vehicles to go down that road.
Yeah, I feel like these are really interesting perspectives, and I love to hear both sides from where you're coming from based on your experience. And I kind of want to zoom in. Like, we've talked about the legal considerations for the DAO as a whole, but I really want to talk a little bit, and you guys know I talk about this all the time, HR and employment for the individual. So I'll just bring this open to you guys in the context of HR and employment. How does a DAO handle issues such as onboarding, compensation, and team governance? And are there any best practices in place to handle things like this?
I have my thoughts, but I'd really like to hear Adam's thoughts on this particular issue first.
Well, I mean, coming from the perspective
Yes.
of like picking the best from these new capabilities and being willing to pick the best from what we've done well in the corporate world, when it comes to things like HR and employment, well, HR and employment, there's a lot of rules and regulations, at least in the United States. And I think it's actually worse in most other places in the world. Well, more regulations, whether you think it's better or worse. And so in both these areas, like, first of all, you might have to have a legal entity to engage in certain things like hiring people. But that aside, there's a lot of rules you have to follow. And usually the rules are wherever you're hiring the person. So if you're hiring someone in Croatia and someone in Massachusetts and someone in South Africa, you probably have to follow different rules for each of those different areas where you're hiring people. And similarly for HR, right? I mean, a lot of it is employment, but then there's, anti-discrimination rules and rules about how you determine people's salaries and what people are allowed to talk about or not allowed to talk about. And so all these things definitely require like legal advice, usually a legal entity, et cetera. But there's also the side of things that's not the legal side. It's just like, how do we do onboarding well? How do we keep people feeling engaged and excited and working towards the mission of the organization, right? How do we keep people from harassing other people in the organization? So all of these are things that I think we should learn from what we do in a corporate setting. Like there's, hundreds of years of like research and experience and books and writing and discussion about the best way to run organizations. And so really what we should do is go learn from the folks who are part of that set of knowledge, and then make whatever adjustments we need to make these things work in the world of DAOs. So like I've seen Bankless DAO, for example, uses ombuds people. I don't know if they're called ombuds people or ombuds men and women, but ombuds people as kind of like a HR department. It's just that instead of like HR having like the CEO's ear and like if HR says something, it goes, it's more decentralized. There's a committee of people. I think they're elected to be the ombuds people, and they're kind of on their own in terms of trying to, enforce whatever rules or procedures that the organization has decided on or that they think is best. So like we can take those things from classic organizations. Same with onboarding, right? My prior job, I ran a college hiring program for technology people, and we had like 50 to 100 people starting every year. There was extensive work. I mean, months of work from multiple people put into an onboarding program. And so while it may not happen the same way in DAOs, we do need people in DAOs focused on onboarding, especially for larger, more complex organizations. And you're just doing it in a more decentralized way, right? Finding decentralized tools that provide, quests and automation and stuff like that, but still being willing to go after and solve these problems that people always solve in traditional companies.
Absolutely. And I have a lot of thoughts on that I want to come back to. But just on the piece for HR and employment, I wanted to talk a little bit about Opolis and some of the things we're offering in the space. So MIDAO, more for the organizational perspective, incorporating the organization in the DAO. With Opolis, what we're doing is helping to empower the individual. So getting them things like their own LLC, their own incorporation, getting them things like a W-2, pay stubs, benefits. So I'm a huge believer in offering these things to individuals and helping to ensure that they're checking their compliance boxes. Opolis is also partnered with Crypto Sapiens. So if you're watching or listening, we have links in the description we're going to be providing for Opolis to connect with our speakers today, Adam, Josh, and just a ton of resources there.
I just want to add, I think MIDAO and Opolis are at least unofficially partners, if not officially, because even most DAOs, like once you have your legal entity, assuming that you are going to go down the path of having a legal entity, most DAOs are still paying people as contractors, which means you're going to have those challenges around, W-2, how are you going to file your taxes? How are you going to get benefits, right? And it's possible for DAOs to provide benefits and treat people as employees, but most of them don't. And so realistically, you need both a legal entity for your DAO and you need something like Opolis that's and I don't know of anything else like it, but you need something like Opolis that's going to actually help people get the benefits they need and take care of their taxes and all that kind of stuff too. So, Rachel and I think both like to talk about how really your DAOs need legal entities and often the people need legal entities too.
Yes, and a big thing that we talk about at Opolis, right, is self-sovereignty, and we also talk about democratizing employment. Now, why do we use the word or the term self-sovereignty? We believe that individuals should not be tied to any singular entity for things like their benefits, for medical, dental, vision, their 401k. We allow the individual to have portable benefits that travel with them, so they can work on multiple projects and multiple DAOs at a time. And all they do on their membership dashboard is update the amount that they're earning annually, and then we adjust from there, and we make sure they're compliant with their federal and state taxes, and all the benefits are optional. So for me, it's worked really amazing, and I'm out there looking for different DAOs and projects to partner with. MIDAO is an official partner of Opolis. MIDAO's logo can actually be found on our community partners section on our website, so you can see them there. But yeah, I want to circle back to Josh on the question of HR and employment. So in your perspective, or from your experiences, Josh, how have you seen DAOs handle issues such as onboarding and compensation and team governance, and any best practices you've experienced?
Well, you got two major thought processes there, right? Like the initial thought processes, there are some DAOs that do have a thought process at all, and that's awesome when they do. You also have lots of them that very specifically have no thought process at all, and their argument is, well, if you're working on this DAO, you're also a member of the DAO. So therefore you're an owner, therefore. And interestingly, the idea of employee versus contract is one of the few areas in the United States and much of the world that's actually decided law. So just because a DAO calls somebody a contractor doesn't make them a contractor. It may be skirting the law, as it were, by calling them a contractor. And that's where you have to start needing attorneys. You have to start doing the analysis of saying, is this person actually a contractor? Am I controlling their time? Am I telling them how to do their job? Am I giving them the tools to do their job? Like, are they using a DAO computer, for example? You know, you have to start going down the analysis of, is the person actually a contractor just because we call them that? Because if not, now the DAO has legal liability that they may not be considering. And I think that that is actually the norm in DAO space right now, is to not think about that particular legal liability. And it's one of the issues that I myself have as an attorney. And that's why I kind of wanted to hear what Adam had to say about this, is because I know there are DAOs that have this in mind, but I also know that there's a lot of DAOs that do not. And so you have to be very careful and do that analysis and not take the easy way out of saying, oh, well, they're just a contractor. Because just because you say just a contractor doesn't mean that. You've had instances in the United States, particularly like California, that was making even Uber drivers with their own businesses employees. So again, you know, the reason that is because employees are owed a higher duty than a contractor. So while you as Opolis may want to make their insurance and things like that be movable, the state of California may be saying, yeah, but they still have to pay for it. The employer has to pay for it. And Opolis is doing nothing wrong as far as that analysis. They could be the provider, and they could even be the provider with the companies, right?
The employer of record.
Right. Well, but the actual employer, which might be a DAO, may still have additional duties. And that's where you really should have somebody doing the analysis.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to reach out to attorneys like Josh, to ask a lot of questions so you don't run into problems down the road, and think of these things ahead of time. My next question for you guys is, so with less centralized authority in DAOs, how are legal responsibilities and liabilities distributed among the participants? And this kind of goes back into what we were talking before with the legal implications for the individual on the DAO. And are there any legal mechanisms in place to protect individual contributors or investors with DAOs?
So generally speaking, anywhere in the world, if a group of people gets together and engages in a common enterprise, right? They're working together on something, there's money involved, there's activities involved. Governments will treat those people as a general partnership, or whatever the equivalent language is in each jurisdiction, which means that every single DAO member is individually liable for the entire operations of the DAO and the other people involved. So if something goes wrong with a DAO that Rachel is part of and there's no legal entities involved, they could literally go after her house, like Josh said earlier, and she would no longer have a beautiful fireplace, right? She'd be doing this from a van. And we don't want that. And so that,
Nice.
like, that's actually the reality that most DAOs are in.
Not my fireplace.
Yeah. And by the way, it's not just liability for like if something goes wrong, it's the tax liability too. In all these situations, IRS or other tax institutions will say, if you don't have a legal entity, that means that the people involved are responsible for paying taxes on the DAO's earnings last year, even if those people did not see 1 cent of that DAO's earnings. Now, I don't know if the IRS has even realized that DAOs exist, and so we haven't actually seen them enforcing these things yet, but it's not going to be very long before that happens, and the IRS starts suing people or auditing the DAOs or just sending you a bill for the amount of money you owe them. And it's another thing that not every legal entity automatically solves this problem, but using legal entities in the right way make it so that the DAO, just like most companies, the DAO, or at least most corporations, the DAO will pay its own taxes instead of that tax liability or tax burden falling on the individual members. So those are two types of liability that most DAO members and most DAOs are taking on themselves today, and they really need to think about how you can use legal entities or maybe other legal frameworks to reduce those liabilities.
I love it. I love where this conversation is going. Just bringing that education to people listening so that if you are working on a DAO or thinking of starting a DAO, you think of these things in advance. And Josh, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so I was on a panel, and I don't know which panel it was at this point. I'm on a lot of them. But one of the panelists was talking about one of their clients, and they had done a project on Cardano. And at the time, they had earned the equivalent of like $5 million. And they had no legal entity. They left it in ADA, the token of Cardano. In the meantime, the value of Cardano had went from $5 million in their coffers to like $500,000 in their coffers, or $700,000. The IRS in that instance is going to look at how much was earned, and they're going to look at everything else as maybe a loss, but you still have to account for it. And so each one of those members feasibly had to come up with, a couple $100,000 to pay for the taxes of this $5 million, of which they never did see a penny. Exactly what Adam's talking about. And that's scary stuff, because if Adam sues me, I always can, thank you. I can always do, several things to clean that up, even without maybe paying Adam. There's bankruptcy, there's, like disappearing into the Marshall Islands. There's things you can do, right? And I joke.
Go somewhere else.
I kid.
Go to the Cayman Islands.
But go anywhere else. But when it comes to the IRS or to the Hacienda in Mexico or to any of the other major taxing authorities, you can't hide from them. So if you owe several $100,000, it will follow you forever. And they will make sure that it comes out, either in blood or tears. I mean, it sounds horrible, but it's the truth.
And this actually reminds me, our Josh at Opolis, OX Joshua, often talks about Al Capone, right? Who went on this like murderous rampage of a career, and the IRS got him for tax evasion.
Got caught for tax evasion.
So it's definitely not something to play around with. And we are in such a new space. I feel like there's a lot of gray area. So just asking as many questions as possible, talking with people like Adam, like Josh, to get clarity on like how to make sure that you're compliant with taxes and with incorporation. I want to ask you guys this next question, and I wanted to ask if you know of any good examples of DAOs who have applied these legal frameworks and are operating successfully.
Biggest success stories currently, even though like always, I always have like, there's a headache here or whatever, like just from, like attorneys are like Debbie Downers all the time, right? But MakerDAO has been very successful with DAI. They seemingly have a structure that functions. It doesn't always function well. I've had instances of trying to get in touch with MakerDAO and just been told, just go on to our Discord. And I'm going, you can't do business that way, guys. I mean, that's the way they do, or they did at one point. But ultimately, under their management, they've got several $1 billion that they manage for DAI. And I think that's really what you're looking for is a success story is, hey, this thing's functioning and it continues to function. And even if there's road bumps, it's seemingly doing what they intended to do in the first place. And I think that MakerDAO is a really good example of that.
If you look at like the top 10 or 20 crypto projects by revenue or market cap, most of them have some kind of legal entity structure. Now, I will say most of them have done it wrong. And it's not wrong in every sense of the word, but I say it's wrong because most of them are foundations or maybe using a corporation. And in both of those cases, you have a board. So like look at Arbitrum a couple months ago, and this was very well reported on and discussed on social media. Arbitrum launched their token, said they became a DAO. Now we're a DAO, submitted their first proposal on chain. Everyone voted against it because it was just like to give $150 million to the foundation, which there was no discussion about. Everyone voted against it. And then they said, actually, we're doing it anyways. And so that's the problem with the foundation is the foundation is actually in charge of the DAO, even though they want to act like a DAO, and they say that they will usually act in accordance with the community's wishes. And even in this case, they actually eventually changed their mind. I think didn't execute that proposal because there's so much social pressure to do what the community wants. But if you really want to be decentralized and you really want to give power over governance over the organization, whatever that organization or project is, to the members, to the users, to the token holders, then you have to use a DAO LLC. And by the way, they exist in Wyoming, they exist in other places, and there's a lot of reasons why most crypto projects don't want to be in the United States, and so a lot of them do come to the Marshall Islands. But using that structure, you can actually be decentralized. And so there's examples of DAOs that people may have heard of, things like Clipper Exchange, their DAO. We have Crypto Mondays, which is a meetup that a lot of people have been to all over the world. Monday DAO is the DAO that governs the Crypto Mondays crypto meetup. And a number of other, we have a lot of like top 200 crypto projects. The problem is we weren't around when these top 10 crypto projects created their legal entities, but I can tell you that some of them are seriously considering restructuring given the developments that have happened in the Marshall Islands and other places over the last few years.
Absolutely. And that actually, I skipped over a question I wanted to ask, specifically to you, Adam. So the incorporation process from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, how does that vary? And are there any DAO-friendly regions in particular, like aside from Marshall Islands, that you've heard of?
Yeah, so interestingly, lots of countries have made announcements that they're working on something DAO-friendly. Australia, the European Union, a minister from there, a Ministry of Finance or Technology from Japan, Switzerland. Lots of people have said they're doing it. I think people underestimate how hard it is to get anything done in a democratic environment, and that's why most of these things haven't actually panned out. Several states in the United States have actually passed great DAO-related legislation. The problem is that it's the United States, and people are afraid of the federal government coming in with its own crypto laws and regulations, and probably afraid for good reason, and then coming down on these DAOs. And so people, unfortunately, aren't using the legal entities, the DAO LLCs in the United States to the extent that I think would be ideal. So Marshall Islands, to my knowledge, is the only sovereign nation outside the United States that has passed a DAO-specific legislation that creates legal entities for DAOs. Now, that said, a lot of DAOs still do choose a Cayman Islands Foundation or a Swiss association or a British Virgin Islands foundation or company for different reasons, right? To Josh's point, every project is different. And by the way, we strongly encourage all of our clients to have a lawyer as part of the process, right? Occasionally they choose not to, but you really do need a lawyer. And we have a partner network of over 200 lawyers, including Josh, that we can refer people to at no cost, so that they can, talk to a lawyer who's right for them, because there are a lot of differences between different jurisdictions. And to your question about kind of the sign up process, the creation process, that is very different in different jurisdictions. There's a lot of difference in how long it takes to create the entity, what type of KYC is required. So which DAO members will have to actually provide copies of their passports and utility bill and take pictures of themselves and sign stuff, right? So we have fairly minimal requirements in that regard in the Marshall Islands, but still some requirements. What paperwork paperwork is going to be required? And is someone going to help you with that paperwork, or do you have to send it to the government yourself? So lots of differences. And probably the thing that comes up the most for people is the KYC part. They want to know, like, who's going to have to KYC? Is it like everyone on the board? If we have a board, is it no one? Is it one person? So our requirement in the Marshall Islands, actually in line with international beneficial owner standards, anyone who has 25% or more governance rights over a DAO LLC has to do KYC with a minimum of one person. So we at least know there's someone we can reach out to and say, hey, like, we can't find your Discord server, like, what's going on? So it does vary a lot by jurisdiction. And really, truly, I would tell almost any DAO, any crypto project, don't just come blindly to the Marshall Islands, right? You need to look at the different options out there, hire a lawyer like Josh if you can afford it, and make sure, that you're making the right choice given all the considerations.
Absolutely. If you're listening or watching today, I hope you're taking notes from Adam and Josh here, giving invaluable advice to people that want to start a DAO or work on a DAO. And Josh, I'd love to hear your input here about the different jurisdictions, or if there's any areas in particular that have stuck out to you as more DAO friendly.
Yeah, interestingly, like I don't focus specifically on DAOs, as I've said, but I looked up briefly just where the first DAO kind of was formed from an international law point of view, and it was Malta in 2018, which I wasn't even aware of. I knew that they had some very strong crypto laws, but I did not have a comprehension that they had been doing DAOs since 2018. And in DAO speak, 2018 is like, that's a long time ago. With the advent of these laws that are starting to come through, I think it's interesting. I do, from a business perspective, disagree with Adam's analysis of whether foundations and companies are functionally the best or maybe a very good way to do things. I think that the biggest issue that I see in DAOs is also the biggest reason that they can function well, which is that idea of you have this democracy and people have to work together to make things function. The problem that I see in DAOs is people are naturally not always particularly collaborative, and that makes, it can, unless people just hit magic, it makes a lot of DAOs that would have otherwise possibly been successful kind of stagnant. And so I don't immediately say that a DAO structure is better because of that pure democracy. In fact, I think through contract, you can build a better form of a DAO that says that the foundation has to follow the votes of the DAO, not vice versa. As a board, for example, that the DAO is the board. And there's ways you can do that I think are smarter. That also allows for a DAO that has a DAO board that's not functioning to basically be disbanded as well. That's the one problem with DAOs currently that I see, is that there's not a specific way for like a vote of no confidence on the so-called board members. You can have a DAO that completely lacks function and there's no way to fix it. And it could have a lot of money too. I mean, there's a very big DAO with millions of dollars that Adam and I are both familiar with, and I'm not going to name any names or anything, but by and large, they're stagnant. They're not moving at all with all of this investment they have sitting in their coffers. And why? Because they're a pure democracy. They don't have any true leadership, and I see that as a problem from a business perspective. Legally, hey, democracy and kumbaya is awesome, but I tend to be more Americanized in my viewpoints of a republic democracy functions long-term much better, and also allows for, when the democracy is not functioning, to have new votes come in.
Wow, that's a really interesting thought there. That's kind of like the piece of decentralization coming into this, right? Like there are times when we look at the old world systems that have come in place, right? Like the centralized organization dictating things. And with decentralization, there's pros and cons because it's kind of a bunch of people shouting in a dark room. And sometimes that can cause stagnation and lack of function. So I think there needs to be a bit of a balance there. And I like your thought, Josh, about a republic democracy. Like people somewhat centralized making decisions to help processes move along more smoothly. And Adam, I see you nodding your head. You got some thoughts there?
I want to add that there's a really cool model that I hear a lot of people talking about now that I don't know if anyone's even built this into smart contracts yet, but it's a liquid republic democracy. And what I mean by that is you vote for the representatives that you want to be, in charge, the leaders, right? But then you can retract that vote at any time. And so what that does is it makes it so that the foundation board or the corporate board or whatever legal structure you're using with a group of people that are in charge, they're more accountable to the people who elected them. And so to me, it's like a balance, right? I mean, you could still have similar issues, right? If 51% of the DAO decides, well, we're all going to go vote for a person who's just going to send us all the money and screw the 49% over, right? Like that is a challenge that I think exists in the DAO space that people are still trying to figure out how to get around. And legal entities can help. But I do think there's one really cool model that's kind of in between democracy and republic democracy.
Yeah, there's that also that other movement that probably is within that same space of the idea of rage quit. And I love this from a legalistic point of view. I think the idea of rage quit's so funny. Like the DAO has a treasury of $1 million. There's 1,000 members, and you don't like the direction the DAO is going, so you rage quit and take your percentage of the money out of it, and you just, I'm out, I'm done. And it strikes me so much of, when I was growing up watching people play like Call of Duty and stuff of, I'm not playing with you anymore. And I see people just like throwing their controllers down on the ground. Maybe in DAO space, it's a mouse. But I love the idea of rage quit. I think it's such a very clean way to express your dislike for what they're doing on the basis of basically being able to say, I'm out before this vote is bad for me. And you're voting with your feet.
Wow.
And I think that's ultimately what we talk about with DAOs is how do you vote with your feet if somebody else controls money of which you no longer have access?
You heard it here first, you guys. Advocate for rage quitting.
I love it, man. I really do. Of course, I'm the attorney, though, right? Like, I have this overinflated sense of justice. So, of course, I want to rage quit.
So I want to be mindful of the time. I know we've been on here for quite a bit. So looking ahead, what are your thoughts, both of you, on the future of DAOs and the legal landscape surrounding them? And to tack on to that, do you see any significant regulatory changes or advancement in the near future that can impact their operation and growth?
Yeah, it's exciting. It's up only. I mean, there may be a step backwards in terms of the United States and the SEC and all the stuff that's going on today. But even there, I see a lot of reason for hope in terms of Congress people that are coming out against Gary Gensler and against the SEC. But broadly speaking, I keep hearing about other countries that want to do DAO related stuff. We already have a new draft amendment to our DAO Act that makes a lot of enhancements. We have a draft regulation that provides even more regulatory clarity for DAOs. So specifically in the Marshall Islands, there's going to be improvements every 6 to 12 months. And I think, frankly, any jurisdiction that wants to remain relevant to crypto and DAOs has to update itself every 6 to 12 months because the space is changing so fast. So definitely from a legal perspective, we also have MICA in the European Union, the Markets and Crypto Assets Act, which provides a lot of clarity around how tokens are treated, whether it's NFTs or fungible tokens. Is it a governance token? Is it a utility token? Is this thing a security or is it not? And so that's a great example legislation that maybe people in the United States could learn from if we were willing to start actually talking about and drafting legislation. So all that's really exciting. And in terms of of DAOs themselves, setting the legal issues aside for a second, absolutely up only. I mean, it's a little bit slower now that we're in a bear market, but most people have no idea how many DAOs are being started right now. Still I see like CoinDesk will quote deepdao.io, which has like 5,000 DAOs listed on its platform. And so they say there's 5,000 DAOs and they have $20 billion in assets under management. I know of 3 organizations at least that have said we are aware of at least 30,000 DAOs that are not on DeepDAO. And that includes MIDAO, right? Because we hear from every day we're talking to DAOs and 96+% of the time they're not on DeepDAO. So like there's lots of DAOs out there, but they're all startups, right? They're as little as like a person who's like, I'm starting a DAO. It's called whatever DAO. And like, we're going to be a DAO, right? All the way up to like 10 or 30 or 100 people in a Discord that aren't on chain yet, but are moving towards being a DAO. So, I mean, I'm not telling these people, look, because you're not on chain yet, you're not a DAO, right? These are DAOs like in the early stages. And so come the next bull market, when people from all over the place, mainstream, are like, what's this new thing that I'm missing out on this time? It's going to be DAOs, and people are going to be piling in. Money is going to start flowing in, and DAOs are just going to absolutely blow up. So today, blowing up, future, seriously blowing up.
Awesome. You heard it here. Only up. Awesome. So, Josh, what are your thoughts on the future of DAOs and just the legal landscape in general and any regulatory advancements you see affecting them?
I have 2 primary thoughts. One is obviously Josh DAO for the win, which,
and name DAO too.
But with that being said, I think, and I've been saying this in audio sessions about the past month, which is, while there's a lot of doom and gloom based on what's going on in the United States right now, the one thing that I prognosticate is if Bitcoin and crypto survive even a complete ban in the United States, that's only good for crypto. And people have a hard time wrapping their head around that from the Americanistic point of view. We have this mindset of, well, if it's not in America, it's no good. And I know it's a joke and kind of ha-ha, right? But it's true. And if all of crypto was banned tomorrow in the United States and yet it survived, I think you would see prices on many of these crypto assets go through the roof initially, and then eventually when the United States opened the door back up, I think you would see a drastically changed face of the world of crypto. And honestly, I think it's only good things either direction that it goes. The only caveat to that is if the United States bans crypto and then sells all their Bitcoin, well, who knows? But, the rest of it is a situation of bad equals good. Regulation, which a lot of people think is bad, ultimately can be good. Same thing with banning of crypto. Bad is good because ultimately if it survives elsewhere, it's rock on solid. It's just doing what it's designed to do. And because of that, even though I'm an American attorney and eventually based on what the laws are, I may have to, re-examine, my field of work. Ultimately, I'm very bullish on the idea of what crypto is going to be on the basis that it doesn't matter specifically what the United States does, as long as it continues to function. And if it continues to function, I prognosticate that it's a huge, huge piece of news for everybody. The one piece of information that I think everybody should be paying attention to in crypto is there was just a bill announced that would allow people, instead of just rich people, would allow normal everyday Joe Schmoes to become accredited investors in the United States through exam. If that happens, it changes the face of the United States entirely for crypto. Even if Gary Gensler doesn't like it, it changes the face. And the SEC can argue over these non-accredited investments, but at that point in time, if they're accredited, they can also be offshored a little bit easier. There's other things that can happen. This idea of becoming accredited by exam in the United States is the biggest piece of crypto news in the past 5 years. In my opinion.
Josh, do you have any resources for that we could potentially drop in the description?
Possibly. I can send you the link, maybe. Bear with me one second.
Yeah, take your time.
We do a news group, and we send this stuff out all the time. Bear with me one second.
Yeah, take your time, man. So just for our viewers and listeners today, I'll get that link from Josh and drop it in the description. And, while we're wrapping up today, I just want to lastly focus on resources to get connected with our speakers today and learn more about their projects. So Adam, in what way do you recommend the viewers and listeners today to get connected with you and learn more about MIDAO?
Sure. So first of all, I host the Just DAO It podcast for people starting DAOs. So since you're listening to a podcast now, you might enjoy checking out Just DAO It as well. And we also are starting to host lawyers once a week on the show, in addition to DAO founders that are well known. MIDAO is MIDAO.org. You can download our guide to DAO incorporation, which is broader than just the Marshall Islands. It talks about all the important issues to think about. And if you want to find me on social media, I'm the Thriller everywhere except for Twitter, where someone else had it. So I'm 0x Thriller and Adam Miller. And I look forward to seeing you maybe on Farcaster if you're in Web3 social, but if not, Twitter would be great.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And for those watching our video today, you can see my screen here. MyDAO.org is where you can go to learn more about MyDAO, how to incorporate your DAO here. And like Adam said, his Twitter handle is OXThriller on Twitter, so you can find him there and connect with him as well. So Josh, do you have any resources we can share, or the best way for our viewers and listeners to connect with you and learn more about your project?
Yeah, I sent you the link for my office to get a free consultation. That is, anybody can do that. The only thing that I ask out of that is do not set up an appointment and then try to shill to me, because you're taking time away from my clients. I also sent you the link for the House passes a bill. And I didn't realize it was such a big differentiation. It was 383 to 18 that that was the vote. And that's crazy numbers, because I did not assume that it would be that. Also, on all social media, you can find me under that Josh, because this Josh was taken and that Josh was taken. So I obviously had to be both. And that's on LinkedIn, Twitter, Web3 social, wherever you can find that Josh, it's probably me.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining today and taking time out of your day to show up and educate about the legal framework for DAOs. I think this conversation is so important to continue so that we can be aware of these things in advance while we're still in a gray area, while these, things like DAOs and cryptocurrency, we're still so new and still so early in the space. So thank you so much for showing up and just continuing this conversation to educate people in the space. With that being said, I'm going to stop the recording now. And thank you so much to our viewers and listeners today. Okay, friends. So before we end today's episode, I just want to take a moment to thank projects like Bankless DAO and projects like Opolis for making Season 8 of Crypto Sapiens possible. So I just want to draw your attention to the links in our description. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see the links there. Or if you're listening to our podcast, you'll also see the links in the description. The first is going to be Bankless.community. And for those watching the video, I'll go ahead and share my screen. So you'll see here Bankless DAO's website. You'll also be able to learn more about how to join Bankless DAO, the different guilds, and different projects that we're working on at Bankless DAO. And there really is something for everyone here. I think it's an amazing starting point for those looking to get involved in Web3. If you're listening to this and want to learn more about how to get involved, Bankless DAO is an excellent starting point. There's guilds for just about any interest here, so I highly recommend going to Bankless.community, joining the Discord, and saying hi and making some friends. To stay up to date on all things Crypto Sapiens, go to cryptosapiens.xyz. Here, you'll see all of our podcast episodes uploaded with a brief description of what they are, and you can also download them from here. Now, last but not least, a lot of you know me actually from my work at Opolis. So Opolis, if you don't know, is a digital employment cooperative. We do things like offer employer services to those working in the Web3 space, working on DAOs, or running their own independent business. So we help issue W-2s, pay stubs, and get you things like national healthcare coverage. So if this is something you're interested in, click the link in the description. All proceeds for referrals go towards supporting Crypto Sapiens. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode of Crypto Sapiens. As always, stay tuned for next time, and thank you again for joining.